Imagine moving carefully through the dense jungles of Vietnam. Birds scream overhead. The air is humid and suffocating. You take a step, and suddenly the ground gives way. Beneath you, sharpened bamboo spikes coated with poison are waiting, and in the very last second, you realize you've walked straight into a trap. No bullets, no firefight, just a simple construction, deadlier than any weapon. Welcome to the world of the most brutal traps of the Vietnam War. In this video, we'll explore the infamous traps of the Viet Cong, simple yet terrifying devices that struck fear into the most powerful military force in the world, the United States. We'll explain how they were built, the psychological effects they had, and why they became an absolute nightmare for American soldiers. The Vietnam War was not a conventional war with clear front lines. Instead of massive tank battles or large-scale offensives, it was dominated by guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong did everything they could to counter the technologically superior Americans with improvised, cheap, but extremely effective methods. Traps were a key weapon. The Viet Minh had already used them during the First Indochina War against the French. But in the Vietnam War, the guerrillas perfected this deadly art. They combined ancient methods with modern creativity, from camouflaged pitfall traps and sharpened spikes to explosive booby traps. For the Viet Cong, traps served three main purposes: wound, not kill. A wounded soldier tied up medics, stretcher bearers, and transport teams. Create uncertainty. Every movement in the jungle became a risk. Slow the enemy down. Patrols were forced to crawl, giving the guerrillas time to prepare or escape. The most notorious of all were the punji stakes. These were sharpened bamboo sticks placed in concealed pits, covered with leaves and brush. A soldier unlucky enough to fall in would be impaled. But what made them especially cruel was that the spikes were often smeared with feces or poison. Even minor wounds could lead to deadly infections. Surgeons reported soldiers arriving with severe blood poisoning, often surviving only through amputations. Variations included funnel-shaped pits that trapped soldiers inside, or barbed spikes designed to tear wounds open even further when pulled out. Some traps used collapsible floors. A soldier would step onto what looked like solid ground, but it immediately gave way, dropping him into a pit of spikes. These so-called tiger traps were sometimes filled with water or mud, adding drowning and infection to the danger. Even worse, some stakes were positioned at angles so that when a soldier tried to pull free, they drove deeper into his body. Another feared design was the swinging trap. A heavy log studded with spikes was suspended on ropes. Once a tripwire was triggered, it would swing down like a battering ram, skewering anyone in its path. These were often positioned so that the very first man in a patrol would be hit, the leader that everyone else followed. A twisted version of this was the bamboo whip, a bent bamboo pole rigged with spikes that snapped sideways into a soldier's body when released. Wire snares were another cruel invention, tightening around legs or necks, holding soldiers helplessly in place, often under direct fire. One of the most brutal contraptions was the mace trap, essentially a medieval-style morning star, a sack or bamboo basket filled with stones, nails, or bits of metal hung from a tree branch. When the trigger was set off, it swung down like a pendulum, crushing bones and skulls. But the Viet Cong didn't rely solely on mechanical traps. They also made heavy use of improvised explosives. Old artillery shells or unexploded ordnance were turned into makeshift mines. One infamous example was the grenade in a can, a grenade hidden inside a tin can, attached to a tripwire. A simple but highly effective and deadly mechanism. Even animals were turned into weapons. In some tunnels, clay jars hid cobras that lunged out when opened. Scorpions or fire ants were deliberately released on soldiers. Even when no one died, the shock and panic caused by these traps was enormous. The Americans did try to respond with countermeasures, trap probes, long metal rods used to test the ground. Special boots with reinforced soles against bamboo spikes, minesweepers and dogs to detect explosives. Kit Carson's scouts, defected Viet Cong who revealed details about traps. But many devices were built from bamboo, wood, and soil, invisible to metal detectors. And often, the Viet Cong placed secondary traps right where Americans started clearing the first ones, catching rescue teams in deadly follow-ups. The terrifying aspect of these traps was their ubiquity. A soldier never knew if the next step was safe. Even on open ground, hidden pits could be waiting. Many soldiers developed what was called ground paranoia. They crouched as they walked, constantly probing the ground with sticks, moving so slowly that it could take hours to advance just a few hundred yards. The medical consequences were devastating. Infections from contaminated spikes often led to blood poisoning. Amputations were frequently the only way to save lives. Long-term damage left many veterans disabled, in chronic pain, or permanently scarred. Psychologically, it was even worse. The thought of falling into a pit and bleeding to death in agony terrified soldiers more than facing an enemy head-on in a firefight. Veterans told chilling stories. One remembered how a comrade fell into a spike pit. Both legs were impaled. When they tried to pull him out, the barbed stakes tore the wounds open even further. Another recalled a patrol that triggered a swinging trap. The first man was impaled instantly, his screams echoing through the jungle. The rest of the unit froze in shock and fear. One especially feared device was the rolling bomb, an explosive charge set on wheels inside a tunnel. Once triggered, it rolled straight toward its victim like a deadly cart. And some of the cruelest effects came from trap combinations. Mines were sometimes hidden, so that when a soldier tried to dodge spikes, he stepped directly onto an explosive. Even survival became a pathway to death. The psychological toll of these traps went far beyond the injuries they caused. They created a permanent state of fear and uncertainty. Soldiers described it as walking through an endless minefield, where every step might be the last. The very trust in the ground beneath their feet was destroyed. Many suffered extreme stress, insomnia, and breakdowns. The constant thought that any bush, any patch of grass, might conceal death broke down even the toughest fighters. From a military standpoint, these traps were a masterstroke of psychological warfare. They slowed down US troops, drove up medical and logistical costs, and spread fear that reached far beyond the battlefield casualties. But their cruelty didn't end with the war in 1975. Millions of unexploded devices and improvised mines remained. Decades later, civilians in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia continued to lose limbs, or their lives, to these leftover weapons. Even today, organizations are still working to clear these deadly remnants. And museums, like the Cambodia Landmine Museum, serve as a reminder of just how destructive and long-lasting these weapons of war were. The traps of the Vietnam War remain a symbol of both ingenuity and cruelty in guerrilla warfare. With the simplest of tools, the Viet Cong managed to shake the confidence of a world power and break the psyche of its soldiers. They prove that wars are not only decided by technology, but also by fear, deception, and psychological pressure. For American soldiers, they were a constant nightmare. For the Viet Cong, they were a highly effective weapon against a far stronger enemy. And if this subject fascinated you, make sure to check out our video about the tunnel rats, the brave men who had to crawl into the Viet Cong's underground tunnel systems, facing the same deadly dangers.